19mm socket. Let's take all 5 of the lug nuts off and then remove the wheel. Take the hubcap off, if you have one. Take the wheel off. 15mm socket, let's remove this nut. Okay, looks like we need some locking pliers on the back side. There we go. That's off. Now you can take these locking pliers off. Keep in mind when you use locking pliers like this, it does damage the boot. But either way, with struts, if they're just as old as the sway bar links, I always recommend replacing them together. There's a bracket here that has to come off. You don't have to take off this top bolt, but you do have to take off this bottom bolt. 13mm socket. Now this comes off. There's an ABS wire that if you follow, it's clipped in right here. Unclip this ABS wire. Next I want to take off these two 21mm nuts and hold the bolt side with a 21 as well. I'm going to start at the top. There's one, the bolt's frozen. Take off the bottom. So I'm going to try to break these free with my impact gun first. If that doesn't work, we'll grab a breaker bar, but sometimes the vibrations will actually help. That one broke free. Let's try the bottom. Perfect. I'm going to put a nut back on the end of the bolt, make it flush with it. That way I have a nice flat surface to hammer on and I don't damage the threads. Drive these bolts out. Okay, once it's pretty much out, some of the way, you can take the nut off. Watch out for the ABS wire when you hammer this bottom one. I'm going to put the nut back on this one as well. Make it flush. There we go. Now be careful because the knuckle's going to want to drop a little bit. Don't pull it too far out. You don't want to separate your CV axle, but it's okay for it to go down a little bit. Push the strut back. Put the knuckle to the side like this, and if you wanted to tie it off with a bungee cord or anything, you can do that, but this one seems to be staying in place just fine, so I'm going to leave it like this. At the top you have 3 15mm nuts that hold this strut on. I'm going to start over here. I'm going to leave the last one in just a little bit. And for this one, I'm going to bring it up about halfway, and then I'm going to hold the strut from the bottom because it's going to want to drop down. Okay. All right. Set this right here. And when you bring it down, make sure you don't grab any ABS wires with you by accident. Here it is. So I have my strut assembly in a spring compressor machine, and I'm going to compress this spring. That way I can safely remove the shock absorber part, or the strut would be called, from the assembly. I don't recommend doing it any other way. Okay, you can see that the strut is now wobbling around. That means the spring is compressed enough to where it let go. Now I can remove the top nut here and separate the strut mount from the strut and from the spring. So there's an 18mm nut. If you follow this shaft down here, it's easiest to do it with an air impact or electric if it's powerful enough. Hold the strut so it doesn't drop down on your foot and remove the nut. So I put some locking pliers on the shaft here. Hopefully that holds it enough for me. As you could see, it wasn't working prior. I have about one more thread left and these let go, so I'm going to resituate them. There we go. There we go. This is out. Unlock your locking pliers. and pull out your strut. Here's the old one. You do want to save a few pieces though. Save the bump stop, and then save this rubber pad. That's what the spring is going to sit on the bottom. And if this came off with your strut, you would want to save this as well. I'm going to take it out of here to inspect it, and we'll attach it to the new one. So here's the new strut. I'm going to pull this nut up a little bit. This will give me a flat area to press up against. Press the shaft down, unhook this retainer. Let the strut go up by itself. You can discard this. I'm going to take the nut off, and I'm actually going to use a socket. Put it right on top here, and this is going to give me a wider area to press on, otherwise this will really hurt you. So I can start the shock or prime it. Basically I'm going to go down, compress it all the way, and then let it go back up by itself 3 to 5 times. That's going to mix up all the oils and gases that are inside. If you don't do this, you may hear some noise over bumps when you first start driving, and this will also prolong the life of the shock absorber. Every time you go down, it should get a little bit stiffer. That's normal. That's what you want. All right, that's good for me. I'm going to leave it right there. Let's get ready to install. Take this rubber piece, slide it on, and match it up with the bottom part of the strut here. That's where the spring sits. And then don't forget about the bump stop. Slide that on with the narrower end towards the bottom, the base, and then this white ring towards the top. Over that goes this cover. That just protects everything from debris. Take the whole thing, slide it up and through the spring, and put the strut mount on. Make sure everything's lined up. Take your brand new locking nut and start it on a couple threads. That way you can let go of everything. Now let's tighten it up. Still an 18mm socket. Make sure the spring is seated where it needs to be. This boot is kind of in the way. Okay, line up the spring on the bottom, that's important. Snug this up, make sure this is still seated also. In order to fully tighten it, my shaft is spinning unfortunately, so I will be using locking pliers, which typically you're not supposed to do, but if you go up high enough, this part of the shaft is never going to go down and hit the seal inside of the shock/strut assembly. So you're not going to damage anything. Usually if you put these locking pliers down low, you'll make marks. The marks will cut the seal up, and then your strut is going to be leaking in very little time. So go up high enough and then just snug this up. There we go. That nut just bottomed out. So that's exactly where I'm going to leave it. I'm going to take my locking pliers off. Everything still works as it should. The strut is spinning, so I'm going to make sure that it's still lined up on the bottom here. And now I'm going to release pressure off of my spring compressor, and everything should seat itself back into place. There we go. Let's take this off and put it back on the car. Slide this back in. Line it up with the bolt holes, push it through, and I have my mounting nuts ready. That way I can start them on. Once you start one on, you can let go, put on the other two, and I'll snug them up, but I won't torque them yet. You want to torque these with the weight of the vehicle on the ground. That way it pushes up on the strut, it seats itself into place, and you get it properly tightened. So I'm going to snug these up, and then we'll come back later. Bring the knuckle up into the strut. Looks like the strut needs to turn a little bit. There we go. Get your bolts. Get your bolts. Once they're lined up, push them through. You can drive them in with your hammer or rubber mallet, whatever you have. Okay, put the bottom one in. get this bottom one in, you might have to push the knuckle in like that. Drive this one in. Perfect. Put the two nuts on. So before you bottom these out, the bottom bolt has an adjustment on it. So you actually want to push the knuckle in and hold it pressed in like that in order to line up everything. Obviously you need an alignment after this, so your alignment professional will adjust it from there, but this is how you get it as close as possible to how it was before. Okay, that's one. Now you don't have to hold it once one's tight. Now let's torque them. 103 foot-pounds for both of these. I might have to end up holding the bolt. Looks like it's holding itself, so that's good. All right, these are both at 103. Let's put this back on with the 13mm bolt. Snug it up. Bring the sway bar link back into the strut. Reattach your nut. That's tight. Let's torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Let's put the wheel back on. On this particular model, this hubcap has to go on before the lug nuts because it gets held on by the lug nuts. So just make sure you match up this slot here with your valve stem. Push everything on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Snug them up. Now that everything's back together, the weight of the vehicle is back on the ground. Let's tighten these to 41 foot-pounds. Perfect.